everyone. A very good afternoon to the Honorable Vice Chancellor, sir. A very good afternoon to all the respected guests over here at this wonderful occasion. Today is the second distinguished lecture, and today's speaker is none other than Professor Dr. Goutam Ghosal, who needs no introduction. First, may I request the Honorable Vice Chancellor, sir, Professor Dr. Dhrubajyoti Chattopadhyay, to please come up and deliver the presidential address. Sir.
Good afternoon to everybody. It's interesting. Presidential address should be at the end, but presidential address is now today is at the very beginning. There are a couple of reasons for that. You know that today in our university at the same time we had 3 different programs. And in all the 3 programs I have to go, and that's why I have to, I have requested Manikinkini, the head of the department, that if I could be excused and I just interact with you all actually over here. Now, you know all that this DESNU is very close to my heart, and DESNU organizes different types of programs which are very important. And this distinguished lecture, which we are going to have the second distinguished lecture on Sri Aurobindo, and basically we have with us one of the most important and erudite personality to deliver this particular lecture, Professor Dr. Goutam Ghosal, who is a former professor of English at Visva-Bharati, Shantiniketan, and currently the member of the governing council of Auroville Foundation of Pondicherry. I must also thank Professor Dr. Prabal Roy Choudhury, the director for the Center for New India Studies, who actually conceived the idea of this particular program and then thought about how jointly they can develop this. And definitely our mentor, the guide, Professor Shubir Dhar, who is always guide us how it's going to work out for the Department of English and the Sister Nivedita University. Now, while discussing with Professor Dr. Prabal Roy Choudhury, I find that he mentioned that today's topic is going to be Sri Aurobindo's view of ideal poetry and his revised history of English poetry. So there are 2 different important words over here. I find that one is that ideal poetry, how we can define the ideal poetry, and the second one is the revised history of English poetry. These 2 things which are very important for today's lecture. Students, you will hear from Professor Ghosal about it. But when if we look at, I'm sure that all of you know that Sri Aurobindo is a prominent Indian philosopher, poet, and spiritual leader of 20th century, and had a distinctive view of ideal poetry. And his thoughts on the ideal poetry are reflected in his literary as well as his philosophical works. Now, when you go through it and you will learn, you will get the informations and also the what is meant by ideal poetry by Sri Aurobindo. To me, that I find that Sri Aurobindo believed that the ideal poetry served a spiritual purpose, transcending more aesthetic or intellectual pleasure. For him, poetry was a means of expressing the deepest spiritual truths and insights. He emphasized that the spiritual essence is something which is going to be very, very important, and it should help the individuals connect with their higher selves and explore the spiritual dimensions of existence. But it should have an universal appeal also. And when we said that universal appeal, the ideal poetry should have touched the hearts and minds of people from various backgrounds and cultures, and it should transcend linguistic and cultural barriers to communicate profound truths. But definitely when I said poetry, it should also be attached with emotion and beauty. So while emphasizing the spiritual connect, Aurobindo also recognized the role of emotion at this beauty in poetry. He believed that poetry should evoke powerful emotions and create a sense of beauty that uplifts the soul, and that definitely going to integrate the form and the content. Now, definitely the second part is again to revisit the whole thing is very to me it's a very difficult part, because how you are going to analyze that with respect to the revisited history of English poetry. Now, in English literature, we know the mystic and the metaphysical poets. Now, for Rishi Aurobindo, he considered the early English poets like John Donne and George Herbert, often referred to as the metaphysical poets, as having a deep spiritual insight. He believed their poetry explored that mystical and metaphysical aspects of human existence. But if we talk about the romantic poets, which includes definitely William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor, Coleridge, and William Blake, were seen by Aurobindo as a shift forwards, a more intense exploration of emotion and nature. He regarded Wordsworth's focus on nature as a spiritual endeavor. And there comes the question of the visionary poets. Now, Aurobindo placed poets like Shelley, John Keats, Walt Whitman in this category of visionary poets. He believed their poetry contained visionary elements and a glimpse of higher consciousness. And at the end, the integral poets. Aurobindo saw himself and few other as integral poets who aimed to integrate all aspects of human experience, including the spiritual, into in their poetry. He considered his own work as an attempt to bring about a synthesis of the spiritual and worldly in poetic expressions. So, Sri Aurobindo's idea continued to influence many people, those who are interested in the intersection of spirituality and literature. With these very few words, I would like to thank the department and the center for giving me this opportunity to come over. But definitely I'm feeling bad that because of the professional hazard, I could not be present over here to listen from. But our Facebook Live helps us actually to listen to what actually you are going to tell us. So I shall wait for that. Thank you. Namaskar.
Thank you, sir, for that enlivening lecture and for that wonderful introduction with an all-encompassing knowledge of British and American poetry. Thank you, sir. Now may I request the Honorable Vice Chancellor to please give the small token that we have got for sir, for Goutam Ghosal sir. Sir, may I please request both the Honorable Vice Chancellor and Professor Dr. Goutam Ghosal to come up on the stage. And may I request the Dean as well, Professor Shubhi Dhar, to please give the Uttoryo. Just a small token from our... Thank you, sir. And we'd like to thank the Vice Chancellor for taking time out of his busy schedule and delivering the presidential address. Now may I request our Dean, School of Humanities, Professor Dr. Shubhi Dhor, to please deliver the inaugural address. Sir.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, let me say it's not only a responsibility for me standing here to deliver these opening words. First of all, as I was saying, it's not only a pleasure for me to say these opening words, it's also an honor because we have with us today one of the most distinguished scholars on Sri Aurobindo, Professor Goutam Ghosal. Professor Ghosal is a very old friend of mine. In fact, we were friends since our juvenile days, and so it's all the more pleasurable for me here to welcome him to DESNU, to welcome him to Sister Nivedita University. The lecture that he's going to deliver today, or the talk that he's going to deliver today, is centered on Sri Aurobindo. And as you know, the Center for New India Studies, of which our Professor Probal Roy Chaudhary is the director, has a special focus on Sri Aurobindo. This was a man who was remarkable in all senses of the term. He was one of the greatest Indians born to this nation, in this nation, and here was an individual, Sri Aurobindo, who was an inspiration and continues to be an inspiration for countless generations of Indians as well as people all over the world. I am here to learn, and I'm sure all of you here will also learn a great deal after today's deliberations. We have a twofold lecture series today. The first one, the initial one, is of course Professor Probal Roy Chaudhary, who is going to talk about one aspect of Sri Aurobindo, and a more comprehensive, a more overarching vision is going to be presented by Professor Goutam Ghosal. I won't take any more time because naturally you don't want to listen to me, you want to listen to our speakers. So thank you very much, and thank you, Professor Ghosal, for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for those warm and encouraging words. Now, may I request our director, School of India Studies, Professor Dr. Probal Roy Chaudhary, to please deliver his presentation. I think we need to wait for a couple of minutes because the projector needs to be set up. As you can see, it's almost there. Please bear with us. Thank you. Roy Chaudhary is going to be making a rather interesting presentation on Sri Aurobindo and the freedom movement, something I'm sure we're all looking forward to. Many of our students here have very little idea to who Sri Aurobindo was. I hope at the end of this lecture, you are very, very interested and very excited to know a world which is much beyond the bounds of literature.
Good afternoon to dear students. It's a great pleasure, honor and privilege for me today to stand before Professor Ghosal and talk on Sri Aurobindo. Well, I am no scholar on Sri Aurobindo. I'm not much of a student either, but it's my reading of history and my passion with understanding the nuances of India's freedom movement that has brought me to this presentation. Who Sri Aurobindo was, will not be able to understand within a lecture or two, because he was, if I would like to put it in this way, a rishi in the sense of the word, in the way the Vedas would call somebody a rishi. So that would take a certain amount of understanding, comprehension of our civilizational consciousness before we try and understand Sri Aurobindo or try to comprehend him. So I would like to present who he was, a brief biography of him and his involvement in the freedom movement. So as you see, he shared his birthday with our Independence Day. He was born on 15th August 1872, and at a very young age he was sent to England by his father. You see this photo of him dressed in European clothes as a student in England, and he studied later at the King's College in Cambridge. We have put up a photo of the King's College in Cambridge as it would have looked during his times. And this is Sri Aurobindo in his youth when he was about 21 years old. In Indu Prakash he writes, "Our actual enemy is not any force exterior to ourselves, but our own crying weaknesses, our cowardice, our selfishness, our hypocrisy, our power-blind sentimentalism." Now you should remember this is about 4 decades after the 1857 Sepoy Mutiny or the First War of Independence, after which now we know that the British colonial power employed such a kind of reprisal measure that maimed the Indians, made them voiceless for half a century almost. There was no cry of freedom. But there were few people like Sri Aurobindo who understood what was going on in the national psyche and could express it. So the Maharaja Sayajirao Gaikwad III of Baroda, he was one of the regular visitors to England, and at his invitation Sri Aurobindo came and joined the Baroda State College. It is now the Maharaja Gaikwad College, and he taught here for some time. So in this picture you see him seated in the central chair with some of his students at Baroda. Most of his students were from the region what would today comprise of the Indian states of Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh and Gujarat. And then it was kind of at this time he says, it is a fundamental and deplorable error by which we in this country have confused education with the acquisition of knowledge. Much as we have lost as a nation, we have always preserved our intellectual alertness, quickness and originality, but even this last gift is threatened by our university system. And if it goes, it will be the beginning of irretrievable degradation and final extinction. This was not the voice of or concern of Aurobindo alone. This was perhaps the concern of other national leaders at that time too. If I were to mention a few names, then Rabindranath Tagore, Sister Nivedita, Swami Vivekananda, and also Ananda Kumar Swami. Somebody says we are cut off from our roots by a mercenary education. Swami Vivekananda says if a child is sent to school, he learns to call his father an idiot, his grandfather a lunatic, his teachers hypocrites, and his sacred books bunch of lies. So that was the kind of situation prevailing then. Sri Aurobindo did get married. This is a photo of him with his wife Mrinalini Devi. Some of his letters to her were later used in the court as evidence that he was planning to wage war against the British Empire. So from a letter he writes to his wife, while others look upon their country as an inert piece of matter, a few meadows and fields, forests and hills and rivers, I look upon my country as the mother. I adore her. I worship her as the mother. What would a son do if a demon sat on his mother's breast and started sucking her blood? I know I have the strength to deliver this fallen race. It is not physical strength. I am not going to fight with sword or gun, but the strength of knowledge. This letter is dated August 30th, 1905. Okay. So this is Sri Aurobindo's younger brother, Badindra Kumar Ghosh. I'll just give a background. He was also involved with Sri Aurobindo in the revolutionary movements. If you read one book I am suggesting to you, you must read. You will cherish reading it, Tales of Prison Life. I have also read it as a student. It's not a huge bulky book, just 90 odd pages, and you must read it. You would get to know some facets of what revolutionary life was, and each revolutionary was a philosopher in some sense. Now in 1906, this was the time when the Bongo Bongo movement was going on, and this, what you see today, is the birth of modern Jadavpur University. The National College opened in Calcutta with Sri Aurobindo Ghosh as its first principal. Now something interesting happened. To open this college, a public meeting was called in Calcutta, and the who's of big citizens of Calcutta assembled there. One of them was Shubodh Mollik. And Shubodh Mollik stood up in the meeting and pledged 5 lakhs in 1906 for this educational enterprise. 5 lakhs was not a small amount in those days. The meeting stood up, gave Shubodh Mollik a standing ovation and called him Raja Shubodh Mollik. And that's how the place where the meeting was held is called Shubodh Mollik Square today. And he became a Raja Shubodh Mollik. He was not a hereditary king. The British did not make him king, but much like Rashmoni, it was the people who made him king. So that is something interesting. Okay? And then this was a newspaper, Bande Mataram. Obviously the title is from Bankim Chandra, okay, which Sri Aurobindo used to edit, Swadeshi paper of India. And okay, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, author of Anandamath, one of the first graduates of Calcutta University. In fact, one of the first 2 graduates of Calcutta University. So it was in Anandamath in which the Bande Mataram song first appeared. Bande Mataram became a mantra in the massive protests against the partition of Bengal in 1905. So this is the office of Bande Mataram in Calcutta. And in 1906, in the editorial Aurobindo wrote, the attainment of absolute national autonomy, it is this alone that will settle down this movement. That is much earlier than the Purna Swaraj pledge that the Congress would take in Lahore, much later on 26th January 1930. Sri Aurobindo had a 4-fold strategy spelt out in Bande Mataram for this national movement. He said Swaraj, independence. This was a word used by Dadabhai Naroji at the 1906 Calcutta session of the Congress. Swadeshi, self-sufficiency. boycott of British goods and non-cooperation of British authorities, the doctrine of passive resistance, and national education. In India, we have been cut off by a mercenary and soulless education from all our ancient roots of culture and tradition. So this is Sri Aurobindo just before he was about to give a speech to his students at the Bengal National College on 23rd August 1907. You can imagine with the garlands around his neck, he was extremely popular. So this is what he says. When we established this college and left other occupations, he was on the payroll of the Maharaja of Baroda. He left that, he came to Calcutta. Other chances of life to devote our lives to this institution. We did so because we hope to see in it the foundation, the nucleus of a nation, of the new India, which is to begin its career after this night of sorrow and trouble. On that day of glory and greatness, when India will work for the world. What we want here is not merely to give you a little information, not merely to open you careers to earn a livelihood, but to build up sons for the motherland to work and to suffer for her. When I come back, I wish to see some of you becoming rich, rich not for yourselves, but that you may enrich the mother with your riches. I wish to see some of you becoming great, great not for your own sakes, not that you may satisfy your own vanity, but great for her, to make India great, to enable her to stand up with head erect among the nations of the earth, as she did in days of yore, when the world looked up to her for light. A time has now arrived for our motherland, when nothing is dearer than her service, when everything else is to be directed to that end. Work that she may prosper, suffer that she may rejoice. All is contained in that one single advice. So, this was the time about he was arrested in the sedition case. Bande Mataram was sued because he was the editor. Bande Mataram was deemed anti-national. He was arrested because he was the editor. He was sued, and after his acquittal, this photo was taken in 1907. Okay, and this is what Rabindranath Tagore wrote in a tribute to Sri Aurobindo. You see, a letter in verse from Rabindranath Tagore to Aurobindo Ghosh. Namaskar, O voice incarnate, free of India's soul. So, if you go to history, you will know in 1907 the Congress split between the modernists and the extremists. So after the split of the Surat Congress, you see who is standing. Can you imagine? Guess, any guess who is standing at the table? Who is standing at the table? Bal Gangadhar Tilak. And the person seated to his right is Aurobindo Ghosh. Okay? And they are addressing their part of the faction of the Indian National Congress, what is called the extremists. Okay? The Bal, Pal, Lal group. So here in this photograph you have G.S. Kaparade, Ashwini Kumar Dutt, Sri Aurobindo and Tilak all seated in the chairs. There are others who are standing and seated in the front. So these were the people with whom Sri Aurobindo had some connections. There were associations. They were also involved in revolutionary activities. They helped the revolutionaries. So Sister Nivedita, you're fortunate to study in a university which bears her name, and Lala Rajpat Rai. Lala Rajpat Rai, you might know, he died because of wounds survived during a lathi charge in Lahore. It was a terrible accident. Okay, the British, so much for their high civilization, did not apologize for it later. Lord Minto, who was the then Viceroy and Governor General in India, described Sri Aurobindo as the most dangerous man we have to deal with at present. Later it was Subhash Chandra Bose and all that. Sir Edward Baker, Lieutenant Governor of Bengal, wrote, Bangla Chotolat, I attribute the spread of seditious doctrines to him personally in a greater degree than to any other single individual in Bengal or possibly in India. Okay. I don't know if you are aware of the British Imperial Police, which is now the Calcutta Police. They had a cell, watch and ward section, which used to watch over the Ramakrishna Mutt and Mission, and this watch and ward cell functioned well after independence up to 1948. The records of this cell has been declassified now, and parts of historical record books have been published. Somebody has done a PhD also. They used to keep a track on the activities of Ramakrishna Mission and how they were helping the revolutionaries. Very interesting. So this is a photograph with Bipin Chandra Pal at Uttarpara. Uttarpara speech is very famous. And so these are photographs by the police of Sri Aurobindo after his arrest in the Alipur bomb case in May 1908. This is the cell in Alipur jail where Sri Aurobindo spent his time in imprisonment 1908 and 9, about a year and a half, and it is the tales of prison life concerns his life in this cell, which I am asking you to read at some point of time. Now these are the two main people with whom who were associated with Sri Aurobindo's trial at the Alipur Judges Court. One of them was Deshabandhu Chittaranjan Das, the defense counsel, and Norton, the prosecution counsel during the case. The prosecution could not prove the case. Okay, Satyendranath Bose and Kanailal Dutt with police. After they shot dead an approver in the jail hospital, they were soon sentenced and hanged. Kanailal's body was carried in triumph through the streets of Calcutta. Interestingly, the trial judge, C.P. Bridgecroft, was a batchmate of Sri Aurobindo at the ICS in 1890. Aurobindo was an Indian civil service officer. He did not pursue his career there, much like Subhash Chandra Bose. This is something very interesting. This is Deshabandhu Chittaranjan Das on Sri Aurobindo. Long after he is dead and gone, he will be looked upon as the poet of patriotism, as the prophet of nationalism, and the lover of humanity. His words will be echoed and re-echoed not only in India, but across distant seas and lands. Therefore, I say that the man in his position is not only standing before the bar of this court, but before the bar of the High Court of history. Today you know how true these words are. C.R. Das was prophetic, and this is part of the court proceedings. C.R. Das said it in the court as part of the proceedings. So Aurobindo was released from the Alipur jail, and in his first public interaction in Uttarpara in May 1909, he said, "The Hindu nation was born with Sanatana Dharma. With it moves, and with it grows. When the Sanatana Dharma declines, then the nation declines. And if the Sanatana Dharma were capable of perishing, with the Sanatana Dharma it would perish. The Sanatana Dharma, that is nationalism." So this is the public reception at Uttarpara, not very far from here. And then this is the Karma Yogin, a weekly review. Sri Aurobindo also launched a Bengali weekly called Dharma, where he wrote, "Our ideal is that of Swaraj, or absolute autonomy, free from foreign control." As I told you, he says this much before the Congress would take a stand. So Aurobindo's concept of nationalism, he was opposed to any distinction which recognizes a Hindu and Mohammedan as permanently separate political units, and thus precludes the growth of a single and indivisible Indian nation. I quote, "Our ideal, therefore, is an Indian nationalism, largely Hindu in its spirit and traditions, because the Hindu made the land and the people, but wide enough also to include the Muslim and his culture and traditions and absorb them into it." So, in Tilak, he says he writes from divine inspiration, sattvic intelligence, and unshakable determination. None is equal to Aurobindo in self-sacrifice, knowledge, and sincerity. Another co-patriot, Lala Rajpat Rai, it was at Calcutta that the ideas of new nationalism that since then grown in a mighty free tree were first expounded and explained by one of the purest mind and the most intellectual of Bengal's gifted sons, I mean Sri Aurobindo Ghosh. Subhash Chandra Bose would later say, on the Congress platform, he had stood up as a fearless advocate of independence at a time when most of the leaders with their tongues in their cheeks would talk only of colonial self-government. A mixture of spirituality and politics had given him a halo of mysticism. Rarely have I seen people speak of a leader with such rapturous enthusiasm. So in February 1910, warned that the British authorities were planning to arrest and deport him, Sri Aurobindo heard a voice telling him to go to Chandannagar, then a French colony. He stayed there for a few weeks and then proceeded to Pondicherry, where he reached on 4th April 1910. So here he is photographed in Pondicherry after reaching there with a few followers. So this is a photograph of Sri Aurobindo in Pondicherry from 1914. He remained closely in touch with the freedom movement, but became increasingly absorbed in his special type of integral yoga, aiming at the total transformation of human nature. He started a new monthly called Arya, where he wrote many books on yogas, philosophy, poetry, literature, history, and society. And I thought I would just make these two references. Our past, with all its faults and defects, should be sacred to us, but the claims of our future, with its immediate possibilities, should be still more sacred. In 1915, in 1948, he says, it would be a tragic irony of fate if India were to throw away her spiritual heritage at the very moment when in the rest of the world there is more and more a turning towards her for spiritual help and a saving light. This must not and will surely not happen, but it cannot be said that the danger is not there. So these were the people in South, Subramaniam Bharati, the famous poet in Tamil Nadu, and VVS Iyer, who were associated, praised, and celebrated Sri Aurobindo, supported him, closely associated with him, Pondicherry. And then the mother, Sri met Sri Aurobindo in Pondicherry in March 1914. She returned permanently to Pondicherry in 1920. This photograph of her was taken in Japan around 1918. Aurobindo publicly supported the Allies during the Second World War. He also asked the Congress to accept the Cripps offer of March 1942, saying, I welcome it as an opportunity given to India to determine for herself and organize in all liberty of choice her freedom and unity, and take an effective place among the world's free nations. I hope that it will be accepted and right use made of it, putting aside all discords and divisions. So, excerpts from a message on the occasion of India's independence, August 15, which is also Sri Aurobindo's own birthday. India is free, but she has not achieved unity, only a fissured and broken freedom. The old communal division into Hindu and Muslim seems to have hardened into the figure of a permanent political division of the country. If it lasts, India may be seriously weakened, even crippled. Civil strife may remain always possible even a new invasion and foreign conquest. The partition of the country must go. It is to be hoped by a slackening of tension, by a progressive understanding of the need of peace and concord, by the constant necessity of common and concerted action, even of an instrument of union for that purpose. But By whatever means the division must and will go, for without it, the destiny of India might be seriously impaired and even frustrated, but that must not be. So this, if you go to Pondicherry, you will see the map of undivided India, and this is a picture of the mother standing in the front of the map of undivided India as India originally looked in historical times before 1947, and that was a time when India had much of Burma and the whole of Pakistan, large parts of Afghanistan, the whole of Hindu Kush region, Arkansas and all that. This photograph is somewhere from the 1950s. So these are the words of the mother. Let India work for the future and take the lead, thus she will recover her true place in the world. This was her message to Indira Gandhi in 1969. And then in 1972 she says, a simple ignorant farmer here in India is closer to the divine in his heart than the intellectuals in Europe. And I would end with a quote by Ramesh Chandra Majumdar in his History of the Freedom Movement of India. There's something interesting about this book. Ramesh Chandra Majumdar was initially commissioned to write a history of the freedom movement in India, but then, you know, governments have a certain way of doing things. He was not at peace with the government. He came out and he wrote his own 3-volume History of Freedom Movement of India, and there's an appendix chapter, History of Freedom Movement in India, which is a very telling chapter. If you ever read that book, please start reading from that appendix chapter. So I quote R.C. Majumdar, the extremist party had an accession of immense strength when it was joined by Aurobindo Ghosh. Aurobindo's articles in the Bande Mataram put the extremist party on a high pedestal all over India. He expounded the high philosophy and national spirit which animated the party and also laid down its program of action. But far more valuable to the extremist party than even his discourses was his striking personality. Fired with religious fervor, he preached nationalism as a religion, and he, the prophet of this new religion, infused by his precept and example, courage and strength into everyone that came in touch with him. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Probal Roy Chaudhary, not only for that rather detailed explanation, but also for access to such wonderful photographs. It has been quite a long time that we have seen such wonderful photographs, and it seems as if there is a point to the digital age once again, isn't it? So it's now time for the distinguished lecture. The Center for New India Studies, in collaboration with the Department of English, is proud to present the next speaker of the afternoon. I know that the Honorable Vice Chancellor has already introduced Sir, but indeed it is an honor and a privilege to introduce Sir once again. Professor Dr. Goutam Ghosal is a former head and professor, Department of English, Visva-Bharati. He is also a member of the governing board at Auroville Foundation, Pondicherry. Sir is going to talk about, he's going to deliver his lecture about Sri Aurobindo's view of ideal poetry and his revised history of English poetry. May I request Sir to please come up on stage and deliver his address.
May I talk from there?
Absolutely, sir, whatever is convenient for you.
Hello. Good afternoon. Let me thank this university for inviting me to speak on Sri Aurobindo's poetry and poetics. And of course, you have Dr. Shubhit Dhar here, who is a very close friend of mine. I know it was his invitation, and in fact I'm very happy, and some of my students from Visva-Bharati are also present here. So let me go to the topic straight. And Sri Aurobindo keeps poetry at the center of knowledge, contrary to the belief that he was a great philosopher. And of course he was a great psychologist, but basically he claimed again and again, or disclaimed again and again, that I am not a philosopher. I am primarily a poet and a politician. So, and when he wrote his unfinished poetic manifesto, which is called The Future of Poetry, which is extremely popular now all over the world, he was not happy with the book. And during his lifetime, he said no to its publication, because somehow he thought, I guess, that he had some problem in what Eliot calls objective correlative. Many things which he could not say properly, but what stands is a wonderful book of aesthetics. And as I have said, Sri Aurobindo keeps poetry at the center of knowledge as the divine Agni. He keeps poetry at the center of knowledge as the divine Agni of the Rig Veda, the Agni that purifies. And so you can see that it has a close link with his philosophy of transformation of human consciousness, not the transformation of the Hindu consciousness, but the transformation of the human consciousness. So, and he started writing the book inspired by James Cousin's New Ways in English Literature. But my wife believes that Sri Aurobindo had been influenced by some other texts. The popular notion is that it was New Ways in English Literature. But my wife believes that the symbolist movement, W.B. Yeats and some other Irish poets, and the poets of the decline who were rejected, like Meredith, they had a large contribution in pushing Sri Aurobindo into writing a kind of theory. Now, in fact, he was trying to revive a very old poetics lost with the Upanishadic poets. Because in classical Sanskrit, the word kavi meant any maker of prose and verse. But in ancient Sanskrit, the word kavi meant the person who just saw and sang. He was not a philosopher, he was not a thinker, he was not a sermonizer. He just saw and sang. And somehow Sri Aurobindo felt, as Saruni has rightly seen, that he was drawn to Walt Whitman, and he saw the first signs of a return, a rediscovery of the old poetics in Leaves of Grass. And how it happened, it is difficult to say precisely, but it could be because the royal literature, the Upanishads translated by Ram Mohan Roy, was available in both UK and England in those days, in the 1820s and even before that. Even you might be knowing that even Shelley tried to come to India once, but he was told that no, don't go, it's a very dangerous land. Shelley postponed, cancelled his voyage. Now, what is this ideal spirit of poetry? There are two chapters in the future poetry. One is the essence of poetry in the first part. In the first part, the essence of poetry, as Tasnova Tarmin, my student, knows it. It was her text. Suprabhat is also here. And in the essence of poetry, Sri Aurobindo was reinterpreting Anandavardhan and at the same time Bharata. And he said that first it is the thought value, then the sense value, and finally taken together there is the soul value. In fact, recently I have come to know that Bharata spoke also of the soul value. But poetry as mantra of the real, it comes directly from the Upanishads. And it was Sri Aurobindo's discovery. He found it in the large sweeping free verse of Walt Whitman. He wrote it in quantity. It's a different kind of meter. It came from the Greeks, and the entire meaning is the quantity of the lines. So he was reviving, as a practicing poet, he was reviving quantitative meter, but not like Whitman. Whitman was a supreme master. So he was trying to see poetry as a means of ascension of consciousness. Poetry which will clarify our consciousness, our mind, and it will have a great role in transformation of human consciousness. He gave an extreme importance to that. So in the first 4 chapters of the future poetry, he spoke of the theory, and also in the last 9 chapters. In between, he speaks of a history of English poetry, and that has been overlooked. Only Shishir Kumar Ghosh had told me in his last days that, see, here is a revised history. But as I see it again, I find this is not exactly revised, but extended, illustrated history of English poetry, and what was there inside, which the normal, ordinary historians like Sainsbury, even Rickett was better than the present ones. Duchess, you can't understand what he writes. Duchess, only Duchess understands. But if you go back to the old people like Sainsbury and Rickett, you will see that they have in their language, because the language is also the thought. So in the first 4 chapters and in the last 9 chapters, Sri Aurobindo speaks of poetry as vision, revelation, drishti, and discovery. And if you go back to Eliot's essay on tradition and individual talent, which he was writing in 1919, and Sri Aurobindo started writing the future poetry in 1917, almost about the same time, you will see that Eliot speaks of plenty of things. He speaks of chemical transformation and impersonality, but he forgets about Shakespeare, because Shakespeare's poetry is a strange thing at times. It has no tradition behind. It comes from the infinite and disappears into the infinite. So the element of discovery is missing in tradition and individual talent, and also about the chemical transformation, it is not that labored affair. If it is a transformation, it is very spontaneous and it's a discovery. And so it was, while Eliot was writing an intellectual theory of poetry, Sri Aurobindo was writing an anti-intellectual theory of poetry. Poetry as mantra of the real, poetry as revelation, direct sight, and in fact Sri Aurobindo could not explain everything in the future poetry. He had to wait, because as Deshpande has told me once that Sri Aurobindo could not clarify. I said, why could not? Why not did not? He said, no, he may be a great supramental avatar, but as a person, as a human being, he had limitations. And that is why he said no to its publication. But when he wrote to K.D. Setna his letters in the 1930s, he becomes limpid to us. And all his theory of mantra of the real comes out clearly in the letters. So you have to take the future poetry and the letters together to understand the ideal spirit of poetry of Sri Aurobindo. Now let us come to the historical part. How did Sri Aurobindo see or look upon the European poets and also the English poets? Now, as I have said, many poets were rejected by the historians. Meredith, for instance, he was considered a novelist and not a major poet. But Sri Aurobindo focuses on modern love and Marpesa, and he thinks that Meredith is giving us clues to that return to the original form of poetry as mantra of the real. And going back to Anandavardhan and Bharata, Sri Aurobindo also stresses on rhythm as the most essential characteristic of poetry. Rhythm may be internal, rhythm may be external. In many of Meredith's poetry, like Darj in the Woods, you will see that the rhythm is inside, it is not outside. But rhythm is primary. Without rhythm, you cannot reach towards the greatest of poetry. Now, so this rhythm is, as he says in the very first chapter reviewing Kazin's book, he says it's a rhythmic voyage of self-discovery. Now, in more ways, he's going back to the Romantics, to Wordsworth, because Wordsworth called it a voyage of discovery, self-discovery. Sri Aurobindo adds a rhythmic voyage of self-discovery, because rhythm is important. And while talking of Wordsworth, Sri Aurobindo says the early Wordsworth was a real poet, and the later Wordsworth became a teacher. This is traditional. Everybody knows it, and we have read it elsewhere by others. There are certain portions where he is just illustrating, extending the old concepts and also revising with new points, like Keats's concept of beauty. I have read a little of Colvin, a little of Garrett, a little of Kenneth Muir, John Keats' reassessment, and nobody has spoken of this evolution of poetry, evolution of beauty in Keats. They just say sensuous poet, with some eye on the higher things. Sri Aurobindo specifically mentions there are 4 aspects of beauty in Keats. And very briefly, the point is the future poetry may be an illustration and extension, but Sri Aurobindo's language is often a problem for those who are not habituated with it. It is not a question of great intellect or scholarship. It is a habit. If you are with Sri Aurobindo throughout your life, you will grow into that habit and you can sense. Sishidda used to say, দেখো গৌতম মাঝে মাঝে হঠাৎ সব বুঝতে পারছি, হঠাৎ কেমন লিপ নিয়ে নেয়, হঠাৎ ঠিক ঠিক যাচ্ছে, কেমন লিপ নিয়ে নিল হঠাৎ বুঝতে পারছি না। this is not the responsibility of the language. This is the responsibility of the thought. Because the thought takes a sudden leap sometimes where we can reach. But if we are habituated with Sri Aurobindo's language, like reading 10 minutes every day, in touch with him, and Facebook has given us plenty of advantage. We get to see plenty of quotations. So we don't have to read much, we get the vibrations there. It's a great thing because people don't read newspapers these days. And it is the most popular medium. So sometimes it is not the language that is difficult, it is the thought, as in the case of James Joyce also. In the case of James Joyce also, the language is not difficult, the thought is difficult. And same happens to Sri Aurobindo when he speaks of the future poetry. It is not a very easy book always, all the time. But when he speaks of Keats's evolution of beauty, he says, first he has sensuous beauty, then intellectual beauty, then intuitive beauty, then finally the ideal spirit of beauty or the divine idea of beauty. Now, Sri Aurobindo has not given examples. So as a new researcher, you have to explore and find out the examples. You have to find out the examples. Because Sri Aurobindo was writing, he was generalizing with not like K.C. Bhattacharya, who never gives an example. But Sri Aurobindo gives examples. And all great writers who generalize, they give one or two examples, telling examples. John Ruskin is like that, Carlyle is like that, and Sri Aurobindo is also like that. So you have to see what he means by ideal spirit of beauty. Then I went to the odes and I found in the Psyche ode, in the very first part of the ode, Keats writes, "Ah, a bright torch and a casement ope at night to let the warm love in." So I found the answer. Sri Aurobindo was meaning this as the ideal or even the intuitive beauty. So these, and when he comes to Shelley, of course, he calls the romantics the poets of the dawn. When he comes to Shelley, he says, substantially, he is the most spiritual poet. And Sri Aurobindo was definitely influenced by Shelley, especially Prometheus Unbound. His concept of Asia and the whole of Act 2 of Prometheus Unbound has influenced Sri Aurobindo's Savitri. And even there is a mention of Kundalini in Prometheus Unbound Act 2, where Asia, Panthea, they go and discover a sleeping serpent. The serpent is Kundalini. And Sri Aurobindo refers to the sleeping serpent in Savitri also. The sleeping serpent rose with its many mouths. That is, the Kundalini rising and trying to reach the head, the topmost center. Now, these are the things in the romantic poets which he found. And when Matthew Arnold spoke of Shelley as an ineffectual angel, Sri Aurobindo was unwilling to take it, because he thought Shelley had something to do with the future humanity, something to do with a better humanity. Of course, you shouldn't go to Shelley's personal life, because the personal life and the poetry may be different. As even in Tagore, you will see that sometimes his personal life is not as great as his spiritual lines always, but mostly. He is not Shelley, he is far better than Shelley as a person, as a sadhak, and but he had pitfalls. Now, Shelley had a lot of contribution, has a lot of contribution for the future humanity, which Arnold couldn't see. Like this, Aurobindo goes on revising, extending, illustrating, and then he comes to Walt Whitman. I'm not supposed to speak much on Walt Whitman. My wife will be angry. Subir is a mentor of my wife, and in a deep crisis of her life, he saved her. And but he won't like my taking up Whitman too often. He said, it's my area, don't get into Whitman. But Whitman is unavoidable when you speak of Sri Aurobindo. And Sharoni thinks Sri Aurobindo kept Whitman till early 1940s. After that, in the last few years, he left behind Whitman, because the degree of realization left him far behind. He was, Sri Aurobindo writes like this: I have in the sonnets, lonely and the unique. He is merged totally, and this merger was not there in Whitman. So also the language is different. But when Sri Aurobindo landed in Pondicherry in 1914, Visva-Bharati came to meet him, and he asked him how to write good poetry. Sri Aurobindo said, read Walt Whitman. So somehow Whitman is extremely important for Sri Aurobindo as a poet, and you can't separate them. They are almost identical in style in various places. Of course, you can't say Sri Aurobindo imitated Whitman, but there are echoes of Leaves of Grass in Whitman's poems, and Sri Aurobindo even tried quantitative meter. And then when we come to the moderns, he knew about the Irish poets, he knew about Yeats. I will keep my lecture brief because I will take questions that will illustrate more the things. Now when he comes to Yeats, he says that of all the Irish poets, Yeats as a poet is the best, but spiritually there are other Irish poets like George Russell, who wrote A full stop E, A-E. A-E is George Russell. Sri Aurobindo says Russell is, Yeats is a better poet, but Russell has a better, greater realization. But Yeats's mastery of rhythm, and also Yeats's symbol of the rose, which becomes a major symbol in Sri Aurobindo's later poetry in Rose of God and Savitri. And the meaning is same. It is love, and it is humanity, it is love of the divine. And Sri Aurobindo stresses on Yeats's early poetry, not on his later poetry. And Yeats's early poetry is neglected. The intellectuals of Calcutta thinks, Kolkata, they believe that Yeats's later poetry is real poetry and early poetry is bad poetry. But Sri Aurobindo thinks his early poetry has mantric incantations, and there are greater moments of future poetry in Yeats's early poetry. Now this is how Sri Aurobindo has revised. It's a very interesting history, but 70% of the future poetry is traditional. So you can write your answers like, and with Shakespeare, am I allowed to speak a little on Shakespeare? Sri Aurobindo Shakespeare. Sri Aurobindo is a major Shakespeare critic from India. Not just a critic, but he has a whole body of aesthetics on Shakespeare's world. And in Kena Upanishad, he speaks of Shakespeare as a consciousness. Even if he did not write anything, Shakespeare would have been important for us. Shakespeare is a vibration, a consciousness, and he's a creator. He doesn't know what he is doing. But he came like that, and English poetry reached Sri Aurobindo was speaking of the poetry reached up to the time of Shakespeare. And he's referring to Shakespeare, he borrows a word from Upanishads, Hiranyagarbha. Now this Hiranyagarbha, he writes, I quote from the future poetry, Shakespeare is not Virat, he is Hiranyagarbha. Why? Because Virat is, in dramatic poetry you have many external presentations, but dramatic poetry cannot live only by external presentations, it must have some internal stuff, as the soliloquies of Shakespeare. And Hiranyagarbha is the luminous interior of Othello, Hamlet, Macbeth and others. So this is a new aesthetics which he has developed, and not just in the future poetry but in other texts. And I end here inviting questions from you. If you have anything to know about it, I will explain.
Thank you, sir, for that fascinating lecture. I'm sure our distinguished faculty assembled here and the students have appreciated this lecture. I now invite the students and faculty members to ask a few questions. I'm sure there are quite a few. Yes?
So, about Windows, you were speaking of rhythm. I wanted to know what was more important to Sri Aurobindo? Was it the rhythm or the spiritual consciousness that builds up a poetry?
Actually, it comes with that. The message, the mantra, drishti, because one can hear, one can also see. It comes with a particular rhythm, and Sri Aurobindo says it cannot be prefixed. Well, you may be writing iambic pentameter, but you cannot predict how it will be like, because the message will shape the rhythm, and it comes together. And that is why he says, and there is a tradition behind it. Anandavardhan has also spoken of Kabbaswa Dhoni, and Bharata has also spoken of the soul of poetry, the soul value of poetry. So the rhythm comes with the message, and you cannot separate it. And like I give you an instance from a Bengali poem and a minor poet, how Sri Aurobindo's ideas are relevant still. Jyotindranath Sengupta wrote a poem, Heart, which many of you have read. In the last line, in the last part of the poem, there is a line, Boker pakhaye alok lukaye chhadiya puver mat. And Sri Aurobindo says in his letters to Setna that this cannot be explained. It comes with an unusual arrangement of words. And it comes like that. Boker pakhaye alok lukaye chhadiya puver mat. And there is a sense of the infinite. Sri Aurobindo says that how would you know that it is coming from the overmind, the highest plane of the mind from where mantra comes, or from very high intuition? But overmind influence can fall on the substance, on the style, or on both. Like when Nisimizical writes, these are all my own observations, because I am trying to use what Setna taught me. For about 2 decades I was with K.D. Setna. He taught me about overhead aesthetics. So Ezekiel was staunchly anti-Aurobindonian, but he wrote a line in Marriage which struck me. What is the line doing there? A couple walking in the park, and Ezekiel writes, wordless they walk like a breeze. Wonderful. And Setna said to me, Ezekiel is a better poet. Lal is a better person. Lal is Anandulal's father, P. Lal. Ezekiel is a better poet. So, wordless, they walk like a breeze. And I have seen in the poetry of Vikram Seth, in the poetry of some Bombayites who were staunchly anti-Aurobindonian, they have also caught something of Sri Aurobindo's vibration and that unexpected and unusual arrangement of words. And it comes from the infinite and disappears into the infinite. Like that. And also even in Bollywood songs, you will have in the old Bollywood songs, in 1960, Shakil Badayani wrote, "Pichkariyon mein rang bhara pyar hai, us rang mein jeevan rang lo." Wonderful line. Why did it come from? "Pichkariyon mein rang bhara pyar hai, us rang mein jeevan rang lo." And it in one line, he compresses the whole spirit of Vaishnav Padavoli. पिचकारियों में रंग भरा प्यार है उस रंग में जीवन रंग लो. And this comes from a popular Shakil Badayuni is forgotten. He was a Sufi. So this is how rhythm comes along with the substance. Any other question?
Yes, sir. Any other questions? Yes? All right. Okay.
Thank you, sir, for this enriching talk. And sir, I just like to ask you a question on. I think the last chapter of the first part of Future Poetry goes like this: that new beginnings or decadence. So, what is this new beginning? What is this decadence all about? Is this decadence related to the French idea of decadence, decadence sort of a poetry that was very popular during the modernist times? So, what is Aurobindo's take on the modernist poetry while he is writing about modernist and in contradistinction with the future poetry? So, this is my questions.
Well, in poetry there is always a fall in inspiration, and also by choice, because modernism, by modernism Sri Aurobindo means economy of language, economy of expression, and much of the intellect is there at play, like in Eliot's poetry. And very rarely Eliot discovers, even many people are very fond of four quartets, but it is religious poetry, not spiritual poetry. Rather, in Westland you have that line, those lines where the priest is being followed by, three priests are being followed by one person. Who is the third who always walks beside me? And this question, as Longinus had said, questions contribute to the sublime. You have that question in Grecian also. Who are they going? This who, ke. Even in Tagore, Sahaj Path, Eto ratre keda kada ki kore. This sense of the infinite, the suggestion of the infinite, this is there, and there is a decadence because modernism was not what Sri Aurobindo came to inspire, because he never spoke on Eliot, and nobody asked him also. Usually he spoke when people asked about him. He spoke on Lawrence, because he found Lawrence more relevant to future poetry, but not that he was depreciating modern poetry, because he said, I can see the perfection, the focus, the economy in their use, but that rhythm is not there, and rhythm is the essential characteristic of poetry. And modern poetry has one defect, that is, it lacks in rhythm. And maybe he was meaning decadence. And also when he talks of Tagore, the Naidu sisters, Chattopadhyay sisters, and Whitman, he says that this is the beginning, this is not the end, because human mind is evolving and there is a new awareness dawning upon humanity. 20 years, 30 years later, man will have a new consciousness, and with that growing consciousness, the poetry will also change. So for the time being, he found that it could be decadence, because he thought that this is not poetry. Why? As he said in the human cycle, poetry is not a notch girl of the mind. It is not a decorative stuff. You cannot make it, as Eliot says in Tradition and Individual Talents. It is manufactured with great labor. There is no question of manufacturing. It is direct sight. And as I quote from Blake, Marriage of Heaven and Hell. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up, till he sees all things through the narrow chinks of his gavan. And Shokti Chattopadhyay has wonderfully recreated it in Bengali. Do you know the lines? বহুকালের স্বাদ ছিল তাই কইতে কথা বাদ ছিল দুয়ার খুলে দেখিনি ওই একটি পরমাদ ছিল. And is a far greater poet than any of his contemporaries. I think Sunil Ganguly is a wonderful narrative artist in prose, but I don't rate him very high as a poet. But Shokti Chattopadhyay is different, because he has rhythm. Any other question? Tasnova, any other question?
Any other question? Yes.
She is Tasnova Sarmin, working in Diamond Harbour University for her PhD under Aparajita Hajra. Extremely interested in Sri Aurobindo.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Sir, actually, while listening to you, I got back to my VV classes while you first discussed about what Sri Aurobindo has said about mantra and mantric poetry in the future poetry. And he said that mantric poetry is that which comes from which is written from the higher consciousness, and it is only mantric if it comes from the voice of the innermost truth, right, sir? So I just got reminded of your classes, so thank you. Highest. So it seizes its hold upon all that is finite and try to reach which is infinite. It tries to reach there. So you have discussed that. So it
will be personal and at the same time universal.
Yes.
Like
Yes.
Eliot makes it entirely impersonal. Aurobindo says, well, it will be impersonal, but through the person.
Right. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Any other questions? I think that brings us to the end of this lecture. Thank you, sir. May I request a round of applause for sir. May I request the Head Department of English, Ms. Monikinkini Basu, to please deliver the vote of thanks. Ma'am.
First of all, I would like to say this to Professor Ghosal. Sir happens to have a long history of association with the Department of English, and from today onwards he is associated with the Center for New India Studies as well. We are extremely grateful to you, sir, for this lecture, which I am sure is going to be a precedence in a long series of questions, answers, and comments on Aurobindo. Sometimes it so happens that in the quest for or the lookout for poets and writers and authors beyond the country, we forget what we have in-house. So I am very glad that the students showed up in large number, and also They are planning to do some kind of continuous assessment with us based on Aurobindo. I need to inform you this. So I'm sure the students are going to turn their interests in varied directions. And this is what DESNU is all about. DESNU is all about variety. Center for New India Studies is a brainchild of Professor Probal Rai Chaudhuri, who has been integral to the growth of this department as well. And I would first and foremost thank the mentor for both of these departments, Professor Dr. Shubir Dhar. He has been a constant support in our varied endeavors, from absolute Bollywood song theme based farewells to serious lectures. My students have been a pillar of support in everything. Thank you, students. The faculty members of DESNU, I would like to extend my thank you to all of you for showing interest, for staying on in spite of your other engagements, cancelling other programs, and thinking that literature is not just all about British literature. So thank you very much. And finally, the line of thought that is there on the mind of all of us, I would like to thank the Department of Mass Communication and Journalism for their extensive support, and always, whenever we have asked for some help, they have extended more than required. Thank you. I would like to extend my thank you to the officials of the university. First of all, the registrar of the university for allotting us space. I don't know if you know this, there are 7 programs going on in SNU today, parallelly. And we have infrastructure to hold all of that. So, very proud of the university. And I would like to extend my thanks to the one and only Vice Chancellor, the most dynamic person at SNU, who has been of such support. He has been delivering the presidential address here, the inaugural address in the 2nd floor, the opening address in the 1st floor, and all of that within a span of half an hour. Because without him, the programs would not have started. So thank you, sir. And last but definitely not the least, the person behind all of this, the man behind the theme, the dream, and the thought of SNU. Somebody who never interferes in the operations of SNU, that is our Chancellor, Shri Goutam Rai Chaudhuri. Other than this, I would really like to thank the technical team, who has been of such support, and my ex-students, guests from outside, faculty members who are here, beyond Department of English and Center for New India Studies. Everybody deserves a huge round of applause. With that, we call it off, and good night, and thank you, everyone.